So let me now introduce, having introduced the city and welcomed you in this hall, say a few things about Howard Zinn, who, of course, you usually say probably needs no introduction. I dare say all of you know of his ongoing and ceaseless activity as an advocate for peace and justice in our own time, but not all of you may know his biography. And I had a chance to become much more closely acquainted with it this summer when I read his work. And by the way, the collected works of Howard Zinn are now available in paperback edition from the South End Press, a Boston publishing company. Howard was born and raised in Brooklyn, worked in the Navy Yard there at the beginning of World War II, until he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. He served in Europe, flying B-17 missions as a bombardier. After the war, he did graduate work in New York on the GI Bill and did work union jobs there while he was doing that, and published his first book based on his thesis, a study of Fiorello LaGuardia's years in Congress. His first teaching job was at Spelman College, where he became deeply, passionately, and very effectively involved in the civil rights movement. He wrote 2 books based on that experience, The Southern Mystique and SNCC, The New Abolitionists. After Spelman, he came here to teach at BU, where he continued his work as a peace activist and a critic of the U.S. war in Vietnam. 2 enormously important books emerged during that period, very important to the peace movement and to the draft resistance movements: Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, and Civil Disobedience and Democracy. Again, all these books are available from South End now. He was also active with a number of other people in this room at about the same time in organizing the Radical Caucus, Radical Historians Caucus in the OAH, pushing for the organization to take a position on the war in Vietnam and for the Organization of American Historians to democratize itself, which it has done quite a bit. So let me just close by mentioning the book that you probably are all most familiar with, A People's History of the United States, which as of last winter had sold 1 million copies. Surely one of the most extraordinary books written by a historian in our time. And I was just listening to a radio show on WGBH, and oh yes, I will remember this announcement on WGBH, in which people were calling in to talk to Howard about the book, but also talking in very personal terms about what a moving experience it was to read that book. And I want to say that this event, it will be webcast for the WGBH Forum Network at wgbh.org/forum. So welcome to Boston, welcome to Old South, and let's welcome Howard Zinn.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Oh. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Louder. That's my limit. Louder. Can you all hear me now? Oh, okay. Well, Jim Green, thank him not only for introducing me, telling some truths, some exaggerations. That's what historians do all the time. And but Jim had a lot to do with organizing this whole, not only this event, but this whole huge thing that's happening with the Organization of American Historians. By the way, how many people here are here through the Organization of American Historians? Oh, quite a few. And the rest of you are just normal people. Okay. But Jim gave you a kind of clue to the kinds of things I'm interested in. I'm interested in history, not just to be interested in history. I'm not interested in just going into the past, and interesting as it is, fascinating as it is, reading people's letters and going into the archives and coming up with stuff that nobody else knows, whether it's important or not, you see. But I'm not, I never was interested in just that. I didn't want really just to be a professional historian and go to annual meetings of the AHA and the OA, and as exciting as they are. That wasn't my intent. My intent was to study history, go into the past, and see what I could get from that would enable me to deal with whatever was going on in the world today. And I guess that approach to history comes out of my own experience, which Jim has just described to you, sort of growing up in a working-class family in New York, working in a shipyard for 3 years, going into the Air Force and flying around, dropping bombs. And then my first teaching job, Spelman College, Black Women's College in Atlanta, Georgia. And I guess all of these experiences gave me a certain view about history, certain attitude about writing history and about teaching history, and it had very much to do with making a connection between the past, and the present. And there are certain times in history where people are drawn to move out of the orbit in which they normally move and out of their professional life and whatever they're doing, and do something else, do something different because they are moved by something that's happening in the world. And we've seen this in the past. It has taken certain very special times and special issues to bring people out of what they normally do. Thoreau, not a political agitator by profession, but at a certain point moved by slavery and moved by the war against Mexico, speaks out. And we've seen this again and again. I think of Helen Keller, who was supposed to just play her role as a nice, successful person who overcame disabilities and became famous. But no, she steps out of that role and speaks out against World War I and walks on picket lines. Even walks on a picket line where they're picketing a theater where they're showing a play about her, you see. And there are people who do this. Tolstoy decided at a certain point, no, I have to stop writing novels because of what's happening to the peasants in Russia, and I have to somehow deal with that kind of situation. And I think of Mark Twain, who again, writing his wonderful stories and so on, but at a certain point, watching the massacres that are taking place in the Philippines, watching Theodore Roosevelt, as you know, one of our great presidents, he's up there on the list. Whenever they love to make lists of great presidents, and he's always up there on the list. And but when Theodore Roosevelt was congratulating American generals for committing massacres in the Philippines, Mark Twain spoke up against that. So we've always had that, and of course in our time too, we've seen people move out of what, Martin Luther King wasn't satisfied with just being a preacher in Atlanta. He had to join the movement. He didn't initiate the movement. He joined a movement that was already going on. Today we see the novelist Arundhati Roy writes beautiful novel, but no. She looks at what's going on in India, look at what's going on in the world, looks at the war, and decides, I can't do this anymore. I can't just write novels. I have to speak out and write about what is happening in the world today. So, yeah, right now, this is such a time in the United States for all of us, where we have to think about somehow moving out of our accustomed places and crossing the boundary into something else and doing something more. For historians, it's perhaps easier, as we're already on our way. We're already dealing with history, and sure, we could keep that history within bounds, but we could also use that history and bring it to the larger public, bring it to an American public which has amnesia about our past. Maybe a deliberately inculcated amnesia, but an amnesia nevertheless. But historians can remind people of something that's happened in the past which might trigger some understanding, about what is going on today. Because if you don't know history, it's as if you were born yesterday. If you were born yesterday, then anybody in authority can get up before the microphone and say, we must go to war for this reason or that reason, for democracy, for liberty, because we love people, and for Western civilization, or whatever that is. And anybody can get up before the microphone and say we must go to war. And if you don't have any history, you have no way of checking up on that. You have, how can you know what's going on over there halfway around the world? So if you do know some history, and you hear the president or the secretary of state or somebody getting up there and saying, we must go to war because they fired at us in the Gulf of Tonkin, or we must go to war because this little nation. Well, it's little, it's true, but it poses a very imminent and important threat to us and to all of civilization. If you knew some history and you heard that, you might not know for certain that you're being lied to, but you would know that the probability was very high, you say. And history cannot give you certainties. You can always grant the possibility of a unique event happening in history, like the government telling the truth, you say. But history can suggest probabilities and possibilities and persistencies, if that's a word. Because then, if the president or somebody tells you we must go to war for this reason or that reason, you might know that back in 1846, a president also told the nation, we must go to war because American blood has been shed on American soil, etc., and you would know that was a lie. And you would look at all the other situations in which lies have been told by the government in order to induce a nation to go to war. And of course, whenever the president does that, Congress immediately, like a flock of sheep, goes along. And immediately, I think that they debated the Mexican War for 1 hour. And I guess you might ask, but surely these members of Congress, don't they know history? Maybe. Does the president? Well, no, of course not. No, that's going too far. But surely there are people up there, is it that they don't know? No, very often there's a certain naivete abroad in the public about how if only these people knew what we know. Maybe we just have to tell them things that they don't know. I remember during the Vietnam War, somebody, another member of the anti-war movement said to me, if we could only meet with Lyndon Johnson and really, just tell him things. No, it won't matter. It's not that these people don't know. Well, they may not know, but they may very well know. But the truth is, they don't care. That's the critical issue. It's not a matter of they're making a mistake, they're ignorant. They don't care. Their interest is not the same as our interest. That is a very hard thing for people to grasp. And it's something, unfortunately, that very often our study of history doesn't prepare us for, because we grow up in a culture in which we're all supposed to have a common interest. The preamble to the Constitution starts, "We the people of the United..." No, it wasn't we the people of the United States who established the Constitution. No, it was 55 white, prosperous men in Philadelphia who put this thing together. It wasn't we the people. It wasn't black people, it wasn't women, it wasn't Native Americans, it wasn't working people. We are not all one. We don't all have the same interest. We are a country which from the very beginning had different groups and different classes and different interests from the very beginning. But our culture uses language which conceals this. Our culture keeps talking about the national interest, national defense, national security, as if when, everybody has the same notion of security, and everybody has the same notion of defense, and everybody has the same national interest. I mean, you'll hear politicians or intellectuals who are close to politicians say, very soberly, whether we go to war in this place or not depends on whether it is in the national interest. Wait a while. Whose interest? Maybe to the interest of Bush, it may be interest of Exxon, but is it to our interest? No. That insight that we are a country of different interests is very important in determining what kind of a citizen you will be and how gullible you will be or how skeptical you will be in listening to the words from on high. Now, we didn't start out in this country as people with the same. We start out right from the beginning there were people with huge grants of land, and there were other people with nothing, and there were people who were servants, and then there were black people who were slaves, and there were landlords and there were tenants, and right from the beginning those clashes, those conflicts emerged almost immediately. All through that long period before the Revolutionary War, and then during the Revolutionary War, it wasn't simply, we're all in this together, we're all fighting the national interest against England. No, it wasn't that way at all. No. People had to be, all sorts of things had to be done to put together an army against England, as armies always have to be put together by threats, by seductions, by promises of what would be given to them after the war, and so on. And during the war, the class differences showed up again and again. There were mutinies in the Revolutionary Army by privates against the officers because the privates were being treated like dirt, and they were not getting any clothes, and they were not getting food, and they were not getting paid, and they looked at where the officers were living lavishly. And this is a very old story in the military. It's a very old and new story. The difference between the way the officers live, I know because I was once an officer. Before I was an officer, I was a private. and the difference between how a private lived in the military and how an officer lived in the military was very, very stark, you see. And it's a long, persistent fact. And so they mutinied in the Pennsylvania line and the New Jersey line. Thousands mutinied against Washington, and Washington first dealt with, because there were thousands of them, dealt with it very carefully and made concessions and so on. But when the New Jersey line mutinied, and there were only a small number of them, he said, shoot the leaders. And they did, and they were shot by their own fellow mutineers. And when they came back, when the soldiers came back after the revolution, and some of them got little pieces of land here and there promised to them and so on, they recognized the fact that they were not being treated as heroes because they had fought in a revolution, and that the people who controlled the politics of the various states seemed to be controlling their lives and taxing them and burdening them and making life difficult for them. And so we had rebellions take place throughout the colonies. You remember Shays' Rebellion, right? Almost everybody knows about Shays' Rebellion, I find, because it's on every multiple choice test that has ever been given, you see. But Shays' Rebellion, farmers in western Massachusetts gathering by the thousands around courthouses, and because they'd been taxed too heavily, they couldn't pay, the farmers were being taken away from them, they gathered around the courthouses and refused to let the proceedings go on. And this happens all over towns in western Massachusetts, in Springfield and Amherst and Northampton and Great Barrington. And this not only happens in western Massachusetts, it's happening in 1986, early 1987, happening in various places around the country. It's happening in New Jersey, it's happening in Virginia, it's happening in the Carolinas, and it's happening in Pennsylvania. I make this point because, although Shays' Rebellion is crushed, when the Founding Fathers get together in Philadelphia to put together the Constitution, they are extremely conscious of Shays' Rebellion and of the other rebellious things that are happening around the country. I found it in the teaching that goes on in the high schools and probably colleges, and that while they may talk about, they certainly will talk about the Constitution, and they may talk about Shays' Rebellion, but they rarely will talk about the connection between Shays' Rebellion and the Constitution. That is, in the fact that these rebellions led to an exchange of worry among the Founding Fathers, and the idea that we must have a strong central government that will be able to put down these rebellions. I mean, that generally isn't taught. What's taught is, we're going to do away with that chaos of the Articles of Confederation. We're going to set up a government which is firm and strong and capable and so on. But somehow they leave out the notion of the control of dissent represented by a new, strong central government. Right after Shays' Rebellion, just as an example of the kind of worry, as I say, that went on, General Henry Knox of Massachusetts, who was with Washington in the war, and now forms a veterans organization. Not exactly a rank-and-file veterans organization, but an elite veterans organization called the Order of the Cincinnati. And Knox writes to Washington, and he says, talking about the rebels, Shays' rebels, he says, they see the weakness of the government. They feel at once their own poverty compared to the opulent and their own force. Their creed is that the property of the U.S. has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore should be the common property of all. Well, no. That must not be. These people who fought in the revolution think that they deserve an equal share of the wealth of this country. Ridiculous. But think about the persistence of that notion of young people induced to go to war for some glorious thing, and then they come out of the war and they look for a better world, you know, and hope to reap some of the rewards for the sacrifices they've made, and they find, no, forget about it. This is a new situation. Well, the Constitution is set up to create a strong central government, which, you know, has many nice, efficient features about it, but which also enables this government to put down slave revolts, to put down troublesome Indians out west, to raise the taxes needed to pay off the bonds of the bondholders. Yeah, it's a class document, the Constitution. When Charles Beard dared to say this in 1913, when he wrote an economic interpretation of the Constitution, people were outraged. Well, some people were outraged. You know, whenever somebody says people were outraged, you have to ask, wait, which people? The New York Times was outraged. So much so they wrote an editorial. It's not often that the New York Times writes an editorial about a historian. I mean, we should be proud, I suppose. But the New York Times wrote an editorial denouncing Beard for daring to impugn the motives of the founding fathers, you know. But, in fact, a government was set up that would serve the interests of the rich. And it stayed that way. There's a persistent line running from Hamilton's economic program right after the first Congress convenes, a persistent line running from that through the great subsidies to the corporations in the 19th century, to the oil depletion allowances of our time, to the corporate welfare and the great contracts to Halliburton. And I mean, that's what the government has been in the business of. Business. That's what the government has been. And all from then to now, it's been a class society. And no economic rights in the Constitution. Political rights in the Bill of Rights, but in fact those political rights in turn depend to a great extent on economic rights. And no economic rights in the Constitution. Franklin Roosevelt, to his credit, was prompted to call for an economic Bill of Rights when he was running for president in his second term. But no economic Bill of Rights. And so what is the result of that? The result of that very important lesson. Working people had to gain their economic rights on their own. They had to organize. They had to go on strike. They had to face the police and the sheriffs and the National Guard and the Army. They had to win the 8-hour day by themselves. The government wasn't going to do it for them. In fact, the government was going to be an obstacle to them. It was going to use the courts and use the military in order to prevent them from changing their conditions. But in fact, this has been the history of whatever economic progress we have made for ordinary people in this country, and that is it's been made not by the initiative of government, but by the sacrifice of people who demanded their rights of the government and became at certain points in history strong enough and united enough to achieve something. And this, I think, history bears out again and again this basic notion that whenever there are serious problems to be solved, you cannot depend on sort of the beautiful language of the Constitution, the structure of government, or what is presented to us in junior high school as, the checks and balances, the three branches of government. I remember sitting there transfixed in my seat in junior high school as the teacher put on the board the three executive, judicial, legislative, and drew lines between them and say, wow, checks and balances, what a great idea. But, it's like what Gandhi said of Western civilization, a great idea, checks and balances. There's a laugh. Congress checking the president when the president wants to go to war. The Supreme Court checking the president and Congress when an unconstitutional war is waged. No. Can't depend on the structure of government to redress serious grievances. Nobody knows this better than black people who study their own history. Nowhere except in the history of black people in this country is this more clear that certainly black people couldn't depend on the Constitution, which legitimized slavery. And they couldn't depend on the government to end slavery. They had to create a powerful movement against slavery, which from the 1830s to the late 1850s grew and grew and grew, and committed civil disobedience and broke the law, violated the Fugitive Slave Act, rescued slaves. Right here in Boston, rescue a slave named Shadrach. But it happened in other places, in Oberlin, Ohio, and Christiana, Pennsylvania. The people going into courthouses, going into police stations, rescuing slaves who were going to be sent back to their masters. Here in Boston, they rescued a slave named Shadrach and got him on the Underground Railroad and sent him to Canada safely. And 12 people were put on trial for causing that escape, 6 blacks and 6 whites. They were acquitted by the jury. That's how powerful the anti-slavery sentiment had gone by that time, which is, I suppose, another lesson that the courts by themselves are not going to mete out justice until the atmosphere around the courts is such that justice, will be demanded. Well, so yes, historians can remind people in a very important way. And they can remind people about occupations. Right, we're now occupying Iraq. And if you were to believe some of the political leaders and news commentators and columnists, we're occupying Iraq in order to bring democracy to Iraq. Maybe not only to Iraq, but maybe to the whole Middle East. Maybe to the world, which is waiting for us to bring democracy to them. Yes. For some reason, the rest of the world doesn't look at it that way. Obviously, they don't know. Or maybe the reason the rest of the world takes such a different view of the present war and occupation in Iraq is that the rest of the world doesn't watch Fox News. You see. Which suggests that information is important, which suggests that history is important, which suggests that it's very important for us whether we're officially historians or not, because all of us can be historians, all of us can study history, and all of us can teach history, and all of us can pass on history, right? And I hate to say that as an official historian. I hate to say that other people can do history also. I remember that Stoughton Lynn got into trouble when he was no longer a historian and became a labor lawyer and went to work for his first labor law firm. And while he was working for his first labor law firm, he wrote a little pamphlet about labor law, a sort of simple pamphlet on labor law for working people. And his first sentence was, you don't need a labor lawyer. He was immediately fired by the labor law firm that he worked for. Have I got that right, Staunton? It's close, right? That's all I ask. Close. Yeah. Almost everything I tell you will be close to the truth. Yeah. But yeah, we can tell people about occupations, and the history of occupation. Yeah. And what do we go back to? We can go back to the history of wars fought in the name of freedom and democracy and so on. We go to war in Cuba in 1898 to liberate the Cubans from Spain, because that's the way we are. And in fact, we succeed. The Cubans gained freedom from Spain, but not from us. Spain is out, we are in. Spain is gone, American corporations are in Cuba. You know, United Fruit, the banks, the railroad, they're all in Cuba. We've liberated Cuba. And from that point on, Cuba is ours. We even helped Cuba write a constitution. We're good at that. Have you noticed that? I know it's amazing to me how these supposedly educated, intelligent people in these high-level newspapers get excited about, wow, Iraq will have a new constitution. So what? You know, is that what determines liberty and democracy and freedom, whether you have a constitution or not? The Soviet Union had a great constitution, by the way. It's easy to have a good constitution. Well, they'll have a constitution, and American troops will be patrolling the streets and breaking into people's homes whenever they suspect somebody of having done something. No, the occupation, of Cuba went on back and forth because we gave ourselves the right when we wrote an amendment in the Constitution, we gave ourselves the right to intervene and send military forces into Cuba and also set up a permanent military base in Cuba. And then, of course, the Philippines. I don't know if you noticed this, but President Bush spoke not long ago to the Philippine National Congress. Well, I have to read this. Well, if I don't have it, I'll make it up. That's what we do. It's called scholarship. And he said, America is proud of its part in the great story of the Filipino people. Together, our soldiers liberated the Philippines from colonial rule. Well, you must have very good advisors who really know history. Well, maybe, liberated the Philippines from colonial rule. There again, Spain is out, we are in. But we liberate, no, Cuba, it just took a few months, and it was the end of the armed conflict. In the Philippines, it goes on for years and years and years, a brutal war against the Filipinos, in the course of which perhaps 600,000 Filipinos die, you say. And then the United States has the Philippines for a very long time, for at least 50 years, and really beyond that, even after we declare, we're finally getting out of the Philippines. So, these occupations, and if you look at the interventions and look at the wars, and look at the rhetoric that surrounds those interventions and wars, if you just know some of that history, you could never possibly believe anything that the administration says or that its supporters say. And some of them are, really intellectual supporters say about how we are going to bring, democracy, and liberty, to Iraq. And by the way, talking about getting history a little wrong. Colin Powell gave a talk in which he said, if I can, you may remember that there was the Mexican ambassador to the United Nations made a remark which was critical of United States behavior towards Mexico. He said, the United States has treated Mexico like its backyard. Wow. How could he dare say something like that, you see? And immediately he was dismissed. You know, it's possible the United States has a little clout with Mexico. And he was dismissed. And Colin Powell said, we never, ever in any way would treat Mexico as some backyard or as a second-class nation. We have too much of a history that we have gone through together. Well, it's true. I mean, we have a lot of history we've gone through together. But he didn't go into any detail about what that history was. He didn't talk about taking 40% of Mexican territory in a war which we instigated. He didn't talk about Wilson sending warships to the Mexican shores to bombard Veracruz and kill several hundred Mexicans because the Mexicans had arrested some American sailors claiming that they were drunk, which is very hard to believe, actually. And well, I probably don't have to recite you know, if you know anything about history of American foreign policy, you know it's not a history which we can point to, as a glorious example in bringing liberation to the world. I mean, there were all those interventions of the Cold War, all the overthrow of democratically elected governments in Iran in '53, in Guatemala '54, in Chile in '73, all of that, you see. And of course, then the war in Vietnam, several million lives gone, Vietnamese lives gone in the war in Vietnam. And all of this, and this has resonance for today, all of this done in the name of fighting communism. Now, what happened in Guatemala had nothing to do with communism, but we intervened anyway. And what happened in Iran has nothing to do with communism. It had to do with the nationalization of oil. In Guatemala, it had to do with taking United Fruit Lands. In Chile, it had to do with creating worries for Anaconda Copper and IT&T. No, it's not communism. And Vietnam, did we go into Vietnam? Well, yes, the North Vietnam was communist, but we didn't say we're going into Vietnam just to stop the North Vietnamese communists. We're going to stop the march of communism in the world, because if communism took over in Vietnam, well, soon it would be in Hoboken, New Jersey, or wherever, what I find interesting in the parallel between the communism being used as an excuse, really, to do what the United States has always done, and now terrorism being an excuse to do whatever the United States wants to do in the world. I mean, you can check up very easily on whether communism was the reason for our intervening in all these countries, and not only by the fact that it wasn't an issue in a number of these places where we sent military force or overthrew governments, but you could simply ask the question, what was the United States doing in the world before 1917, before there was a Soviet Union? We must have been a peaceful nation that didn't go anywhere and do anything. No. But we had occupied Haiti in 1915, 2 years before the Soviet Union, and stayed there for a very long time and killed several thousand Haitians who dared to resist. No. Fear, the use of fear in both situations, the fear of communism, the fear of terrorism, and both being covers for what was really the common denominator for American foreign policy from right after the Revolution down to the present day, the common denominator being the expansion of American power in the world. economic power, political power, military power. Yeah, we are an imperial power. And there are intellectuals who say, yes, but we're a benign imperial power. But that's what imperial powers have always said. Imperial powers have never said, we're a cruel imperial power. No, they've always said, no, we're doing good things for people. We're building schoolhouses and railroads and cleaning the streets and so on and so on. A benign. You just pick up the newspaper one day and you read where you see a picture, and this is rare because our newspapers do not show very much, and certainly our government tells us nothing about what we are doing. They give us the figures on Americans killed, 560 Americans killed in the Iraq War, but they don't give us figures or show us pictures really of what happens to the Iraqi people in this war. But the fact that we've killed, and nobody knows how many, 7,000, 10,000, 15,000 Iraqis killed in a very short war. In a very short war. Shock and awe. People killed and people amputated, people blinded. And one day in the New York Times, there's a picture, you may have seen it, of this kid who had lost an eye in the American bombardment, and his family was trying to get compensation because the American Army was giving out $5,000 if you were a civilian and you lost your life in a bombing, that your family could get $5,000. Reminded me of something very similar that happened during the Vietnam War, and I'll stop very soon. The clock here is huge. I mean, you have no excuse for going. There's no way of missing it. $5,000. This man who watched his wife burn to death, and also his 3 children after an American missile struck their house, he got $5,000. And going back into my files, 1966, the Pentagon decided during the Vietnam War that for every civilian killed in Vietnam, they would give as compensation $34. So, no, benign imperialism, no. And so we are at a point where the country is in the hands of a small group of ruthless people who have no concern. You see, no concern for human life, no concern for human liberty. And therefore, as has always been the case in American history, it's up to us as citizens to become an obstacle to what they're doing and to change the course of this country's history. It's up to us, it's up to the citizens of the country, and there's a lot of possibility out there. I believe in the fundamental basic decency of people, that when they learn the truth, they react. That's what happened during the Vietnam War. When people began to learn the truth of what we were doing in Vietnam, they turned against the war. Our job is to help people and help ourselves learn the truth. And as has happened before in American history, when people have got together, whether it's against racial segregation or for the rights of women or the rights of gays and lesbians or disabled people, whenever people have gotten together, understanding that the government wasn't going to do it for them, whenever they've done that, democracy has come alive. And it is our job today to bring democracy alive again. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a little break and let people come up to the place.
So, you want to initiate the question period?
All right. right. Thank you very much, Howard. I don't know if many of you have been in a meeting with Howard before, a situation, but the question and answer is always, in some ways, the best part. So we have a microphone here. This is not for children. We can raise it up, anybody of any height, and up there. So if you'd like to have a question or a comment or anecdote or a story or something that you'd like to share with us or a question for Howard, please come forward and we'll get the microphone in order. Is it working?
Jerry?
Testing? Great.
I'm going to alternate. These people are not second-class citizens of you. They'll get equal time with the people on the floor. So one here and then one there.
Thank you, Howard. I'm Jesse Leamish. I'm here speaking for Historians Against the War. We are a group of historians and activists. We are activist historians. We seek to emulate the model of Howard. We say, live like Howard, 2, 3, many Howards. I am proud and delighted to be able in this place, with this speaker and this audience, to announce for the first time that the Organization of American Historians acted this afternoon to set up an inquiry about repression of historians in response to an initiative taken by Historians Against the War. I have this from Jim Horton, who's the incoming president of the OAH. We asked them to establish a committee of historians to investigate reports of repressive measures having an impact on historians' teaching, research, employment, and freedom of expression. I'm also so pleased to announce that that committee will be chaired by David Montgomery, who is here tonight, who invites complaints, data, information by email to him, david.montgomery@Yale.edu. This committee will make its own agenda. Among the things we asked them to look into, restrictions of research and surveillance of library use under the USA Patriot Act, the repeal of which has been advocated by a growing number of faculty senates, reports of politicization of the grant process at the National Endowment for the Humanities with flagging and rejection of grants in areas deemed politically sensitive, exclusion, harassment, and demeaning treatment of foreign-born historians and students by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the State Department, restriction of historians' access to government records, and new limits to enforcement of the Freedom of Information Act, and many other things. So congratulations to the OAH, and I think congratulations to Historians Against the War. Many of you have seen and signed our statement, which is available in the back of the room at a table, opposing expansion of the United States empire and the doctrine of preemptive war that have led to the occupation of Iraq. We deplore the secrecy, deception, and distortion of history involved in the administration's conduct, and so on. Please read our statement, and we hope that afterwards you will join others, now about 1,000 who have signed this. I'm happy to say that this afternoon, as I solicited signatures, the first 3 signers this afternoon were Nelson Lichtenstein, Eric Foner, and the same Jim Horton, who is the incoming president of the OAH. So good for the OAH, and please join us.
Yes.
Good evening. You bring up the use of democracy and freedom to justify some, that rhetoric has been used to justify conflict. And I can't think of a conflict that the United States has been involved in which democracy and freedom is not brought up as one of the reasons why we're fighting. And these are very important principles for our country. I mean, we're taught them from kindergarten. And they're nice, simple concepts. How do we balance we want people to be committed to democracy and freedom, but we don't want it to be used as a justification for warfare. how do we come up with similar rhetoric to counterbalance that? I mean, I'm both the history and political science department at a small community college. So I teach both history and government, and I have some things that I do, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how do we counter that kind of very simple rhetoric that's ingrained in us from very early time in our lives to get people to question getting involved in these conflicts, especially based on those principles.
When you're a speaker, you learn soon that you can answer anything, no matter how difficult it is. But no, it's an important question. I think you're asking, how do we counter that rhetoric, and how do we deal with issues and words like democracy and liberty? Do I have that right? Am I understanding that right? Am I understanding that? Yes. Yeah?
Yes.
Well, yeah, obviously you can't just throw abstractions back and forth and yes, yes, we're doing it for democracy. No, we're not doing it for democracy. You have to, I think, start to examine very carefully what is meant by democracy, who gains, who loses, whose voice is listened to, whose voice is not listened to. You have to extend the idea of democracy beyond our national borders to assume that people in other countries have an equal right to live and to the pursuit of happiness as people in this country, so democracy isn't bounded by national interest and only belongs to us. You have to examine the concept of liberty to see exactly what it means. Does liberty mean you have a constitution? Does liberty mean the free market? I guess all that I'm saying is that it seems to me, yes, you have to give content to these words, give them some history, and apply them to real situations to see how they work out. And I think you have to deal with the idea that democracy requires a dissenting public and requires an informed public. And democracy does not consist of obedience to government, but democracy requires seeing a government as an auxiliary to the people and as secondary to the needs of the people. That's about all I can think of saying at this point.
I have actually a big question, but I just wanted to comment on democracy. The remarks of the Bush administration and to the Spanish elections, I think, shows the true respect of democracy of this administration. But how dare these people change their government? But the question I really wanted to ask was more about the use of religion. I mean, our country is often, and other countries do this all the time. God's on our side, whatever, and whatever you're talking, whether you're Christian or Muslim or whatever. But this administration seems to really like to use religion and introduce religion, and more and more into our policy. How do you work with that when you do have religious people in this nation that you don't want to offend, and yet I guess I'm a very strong believer of the separation of the two. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, you're right, a big question. But I think you worry about not offending people who are religious in dealing with the fact that this government invokes God to defend all of its policies. But I think it's a good idea to sort of look to fundamental moral principles that you will find in any religion. And sure, you can find things in the Bible and in the Quran which are not acceptable on grounds of human rights, but you can also find principles in the various religious teachings which advance the idea of one human race and of the golden rule, which takes different forms in different religions, which was there. So there's no need, it's not a matter of being for or against religion, it's a matter of taking the moral core of religion and joining it to the moral core of secular thinking to join and base whatever policies we have on morality rather than on any kind of scripture.
Professor Zinn, I'm Fred Dews from George Mason University right outside Washington, D.C. And I wonder how I and others who care to can tell stories of American history in such a way that cuts through the political vitriol we experience on both sides, the soundbite politics, soundbite political culture, and the so-called short attention span, and tell these stories in such a way that is meaningful and exciting for ordinary Americans, just like ourselves, who go to work and raise families and pay our bills and do all these things that occupy our time. How do we make history exciting and relevant for Americans today? Thank you.
Well, making it relevant is probably easier than making it exciting. making it exciting, I think depends on telling inspiring stories which are true. I mean, you can tell inspiring stories which are fiction, but there are inspiring stories which are true, except that you end up with a different set of heroes than what is given to us, in traditional teaching of history. And instead, these are inspiring stories of what the anti-slavery movement did in the 1850s in violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. These are heroic, exciting stories of what was done in order to prevent ex-slaves from being brought back into slavery. There's exciting stories about what Frederick Douglass had to say, or what other former slaves had to say about the issue of slavery. I mean, it's exciting to look at and to see what Thoreau did and to listen to what he said. I think there are very exciting stories about the labor movement. I mean, Jim Green is now, if he doesn't mind my saying so, writing a history of the Haymarket Affair, but he's written a lot of labor history. Labor history is one of the most neglected areas in traditional history teaching, but it's the story of how working people, whether it's in the railroad strikes of 1877 or in the Pullman strike of 1894, how working people defied the odds and defied the great powers, how the grape workers in California in the 1960s organized a national boycott, how the immigrant women in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912 fought against the American Woolen Company against enormous odds and won their strike after a grueling win. There are remarkable, inspiring stories, and of course there are the stories of people in the movement against racial segregation and the people against the Vietnam War and the GIs who came back from the Vietnam War and became leading opponents of the war. These are the story of Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July. Remarkable, remarkable story. And they go on. I mean, there are people today doing heroic things. The families of victims of September 11th, there's this organization of families of victims of September 11 who are speaking out against the war. And so that we have, wonderful things that have gone on in the past and are still going on, and which I think can bring history and the present together in a relevant and vivid way.
Howard, I want to say what a pleasure it is to see you alive. I used your book 30 more years ago at State University of New York at Stony Brook, where I was teaching. I'm Berg Turner, now long since retired. Your book is exciting. American history is not dull. I think American history is exciting. What's dull is the people who are presenting it. That's the problem. And any time someone says to me, "Oh, I hate history," I says, "You had hateful teachers," because American history to me has always been exciting. I am living in a time that is most peculiar, I think. Every day I read the paper and I say, don't they know their history? Of course, I know that they don't. Having taught it, I know that they don't. And I see the things that are being done by a C-grade person from Yale who pretends to be president, who was not elected, but was given the position by a hand-chosen Supreme Court. And talking about the things of tradition, violating every one of the American traditions that he can find, every treaty that he can find, every precept, I think, of our government. And no one seems to be challenging this, and I don't understand why they are not. Why don't you, or the organization, or someone, put out something that will enumerate the reversals and the violations of treaties, of agreements, and so forth that have been committed by this administration in the past 3 years, that will demonstrate the lies that are being put out there as these truths that we hold self-evident, that they're not. And let the people know. I think that the greatest thing that could come out of this meeting and of this conference in OAH is that there comes some resolution to present in some forthright manner the truth of what's going on and how this is violating American history, or your history, as you have told it in your books of the Mexican Wars, which you allude to tonight. You didn't mention the much earlier things of the native population, the Native American, and what has been done to him in the violation of treaties. But of course, that was the beginning of our perpetual violation of treaties, the treaties with the Native American. And let the people know these things and put it in a form that we can use to distribute and perpetuate and put forward the truth, and let the people know that this is why we shouldn't be sitting here. We should be going someplace, getting out the vote to change the administration in Washington come November.
Thank you. Yes, I think we have someone up.
Professor Zinn, my name is Kathy Shager, and I'm a social studies teacher in Westport, Connecticut. Our student body forced us to create an honors level, to create a tracking system for the freshmen and sophomores. And so now we teach an honors history course for the sophomores, but we've created it as a social history. And as a result of that, we use your book, A People's History, and we use Ronald Takaki's book, A Different Mirror. This was a curveball to our students. They weren't expecting us to challenge the master narrative that they've always accepted. And I want to say that it's an honor to be here tonight, and I've written down just about everything you've said because all my kids want to know. They started out, the first paper we had them write was a comparison between your chapter, Tyranny is Tyranny, and a few chapters from Edmund Morgan. And they had a hard time because they would refer to Morgan's book as fact and yours as fiction. Fortunately, they've come around, slowly. But basically, the reason I'm up here is to ask you two questions. One is, what is your response to the invasion of Afghanistan as a result of the attacks on 9/11? And the other one is, how would you respond to the war on Iraq if it had been sold as a humanitarian war instead of a preemptive strike because of weapons of mass destruction? Thank you.
How do I feel about the war in Afghanistan? And I know there are people who are very solidly and strongly against the war in Iraq. And one way in which they sort of beef up their credentials for being against the war in Iraq is to say, but I supported the war in Afghanistan, to show that, you know, they're not complete anti-war people. The war in Afghanistan, what was it? It was in a reaction, right, to 9/11? And what was the idea of it? The terrorists have committed this series of hijackings and resulting in the deaths of several thousand people. We have to do something. That was the point. We have to do something about terrorism. The truth is, we don't know what to do about terrorism. You can't make war on terrorism. It was immediately announced as a war on terrorism. You can't make war on terrorism. It's not that sort of thing. It's not something which has a finite, place that you can attack and make war on because they've done something to you. No, terrorism. In fact, the administration itself said, Bush said it in his 2 State of the Unions ago, and that's how I identify Bush, by his State of the Unions. He said, first he starts on the State of the Union address in 2003 saying, we are winning the war on terrorism. A few paragraphs later he says, there are tens of thousands of trained terrorists all over the world. You say, well, no, you can't make war on terrorism. What the Bush administration did was to try to show the American people that it was reacting with force and vigor and courage. What courage? To bomb a country which has been devastated by war and refugees and starvation and sickness, to bomb this country, to kill at least 3,000, maybe we don't know how many people were killed in Afghanistan and how many people were maimed, injured, blinded in Afghanistan. And at the end of it, where are we, you see? Have we done anything against terrorism? Are we safer? Obviously not. The administration itself tells us to worry about everything we do. And no, we killed thousands of people needlessly because the administration wanted to do something to exert America's military might, to put troops into Afghanistan, to have another foothold in the Middle East. And sure, in the course of it, the Taliban was removed. But that, of course, wasn't the intention of the administration. And the collateral benefit, you might say. But nothing was done in this war in Afghanistan to warrant, nothing positive enough was done in Afghanistan. And after all, the Taliban is back and Afghanistan is in chaos to warrant the deaths of all those people and destruction of this country. Now you ask about what if the war in Iraq had been sold to the American people not as dealing with weapons of mass destruction, but as a human rights, humanitarian intervention, presumably because, Iraq ruled by a cruel tyrant, absolutely true, Saddam Hussein, and therefore we make war in order to get rid of this tyrant, which makes it a humanitarian war. Except that in the course of this humanitarian war, we commit atrocities against human beings. In the course of this war, we kill lots of people and maim lots of people and leave the country in chaos, and we don't know what will happen now that Saddam Hussein is gone. Here's a kind of principle which I think about when I think about war and intervention and humanitarian, so-called humanitarian interventions. And that is a war, whether it's a large-scale war or a small-scale war like, Afghanistan, Iraq. I think about means and ends. The means is war, which is inevitably destructive of human life, inevitably horrible, and certain. That is, when you make war, you are certain that you're going to kill a lot of people. In fact, most of them will be civilians, and a lot of them will be children. Almost any war since World War II is a war against children. So the means are certainly horrible. The end, however it is proclaimed, and whatever evil there is that you say you're going to overthrow, the end is always uncertain. You don't know what is going to happen. You don't know, even if you get rid of Saddam Hussein, who is going to arise and whether Iraq will be a democracy or will people be better off. So you're faced with certain horrible means and uncertain ends. In a situation like that, war becomes intolerable as a way of settling problems in the world. And you are faced with the fact that if you want to deal with problems like terrorism, you'd better renounce war, first of all, as a solution, and you'd better think of more fundamental solutions to the problem of terrorism. Those fundamental solutions are the ones that the people in high places do not want to listen to. They do not want to listen to somebody who says, and the most terrible thing you can say, we need to re-examine American policy in the world. We need to re-examine what we have been doing in the Middle East. We need to re-examine what we have been doing with our 100 or more military bases all over the world and our Navy and every sea. We have to re-examine the question of whether we want to be a military superpower. And we have to ask the question, are countries that are not big military powers, that don't intrude on other countries, do they become the victims of terrorist attacks? Did you find Norway and Sweden and Denmark and New Zealand worried about terrorist attacks? They're not bothering anybody. We are bothering people. We are bothering people all over the world. If we want to, can't stop terrorism immediately. There's no short-term cure for terrorism. But there are long-term things you can do. Long-term things have to do with changing what our country is from a military superpower into, yes, a humanitarian superpower, using our resources for food and medicine instead of for guns and so on.
Hi, I'm Matt Wilding from Suffolk University, and I'm also a chair for Students for Peace and Justice at Suffolk. And we did some research after the State of the Union address after it was a couple weeks later, because we were pining over the ridiculous things about the war for a while, but then we jumped onto something else. He said something about, I believe it was a 51% increase in educational spending, which sounded silly. And so we wanted to find out more about it, so we called the White House and asked what they were talking about and where the money was and where it went, and they didn't know, and they kept transferring us back and forth to other departments. Eventually we got someone in the Department of Education who showed, I believe it was an 11% fiscal increase in educational spending, and that wasn't including population increase or inflation of dollars, so there wasn't really any increase. And so we get the president telling us that there's these things and he says them and so now they're true. And then today we were at the protest against the president, and myself and another guy were detained for 20 minutes for going to an ice cream parlor. we broke through the gates because they let us through. And then because we looked like activists, even though we didn't have signs, they took us and held us for a while and checked our IDs. And it was really bothersome. But I asked them why they were holding us and if they had the right to, because they were letting other people through because they were, shopping in that area. And they said they didn't know what the law was. They had no idea why they were allowed to do that to me and not them. So they kept letting these people go into the same place I was going to, but they held me. So we have people, telling us these things that are in power that aren't true and exploiting their power. How do you deal with that? How do you even approach that? I couldn't do anything. I didn't know the law,
You just have to keep on doing what you're doing. If you see you're getting into trouble, that means you're doing the right thing. That's it.
Someone at the top. Yeah.
Professor Zinn, my name is Hal Chase. I teach history at Des Moines, Iowa Community College. And the question is, phrased the way you have tonight, when people attack you and kill you, do I understand correctly that your response is not to defend yourself?
Is that your question?
That's the question.
Oh. When people attack you and kill you, is my response not to defend yourself? No, that's not my response. No, my response is defend yourself. But how? If people attack you, and then you don't know who they are or where they are, do you defend yourself by just going out and bombing the nearest country where they might be hiding? Or if somebody has attacked you and you don't know where they are, but you suspect that they're somewhere in this neighborhood, do you just go ahead and bomb the neighborhood and say, well, I'm defending myself? The word defense has been distorted completely out of its essential meaning. You can't defend yourself by killing people who did not attack you. We're not defending ourselves against the attackers of 9/11 by killing ordinary people in Afghanistan or ordinary people in Iraq.
And so you do defend yourself by not trying to eliminate people who killed over 3,000 people in New York and Washington, D.C.?
By eliminating those people?
That's correct.
Well, I think it would be nice if we could find the people who did that, because the people who did that are dead. That's the first thing to keep in mind. So there are people who planned that. Well, it would be nice to find them and arrest them and put them on trial, which is what we do with people who commit crimes, even terrible crimes. Yeah, that's what we should be doing, but that's not what we are doing. We're not doing that. We're not treating these as crimes where you look for the person who committed the crime and you apprehend that person and you incarcerate that person. No, we're just striking out blindly. The truth is this government is not interested in doing anything about terrorism. If it were, it wouldn't be doing what it's doing, because what it's doing is increasing terrorism in the world. And one of the things that Richard Clarke...
And so you fought against Hitler.
Excuse me?
You fought against Hitler. And so should we not have responded to that?
War. But it's not that simple, because war isn't that simple. But in fact, you have to ask yourself whether the situation we face with 9/11 is a situation like Hitler. With Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Osama bin Laden, is that the kind of situation? Does Iraq represent a country which is devouring, expanding all over the world? Well, what country meets that description? This is not World War II. This is not Hitler. This is not Pearl Harbor. Yet the situation has to be met with its own specificity, and when you look at it very specifically, you have to come to the conclusion that what we've been engaging in is an immoral set of acts surrounded by lies and deceptions.
Wasn't the immoral act in New York and in Washington, D.C.? And I ask you one final question. Did you lose, and has anybody here lost a family member on 9/11?
By the way, I told you
Is there anybody here? Hands up.
I lost a good friend.
Okay.
But I don't feel that the way we are retaliating is the appropriate way.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
I'm David Calverley, and
Seat down.
Just want to give someone else a turn, all right? Thank you.
David Calverley, a professor of psychology, not history. But I'm fascinated with your talk this evening. I appreciate you talking to us. I do have a question, though. I've recently finished reading The Rise of the Vulgans, a new book out on Bush's war team, and found it very interesting. And that my question is, are there any examples where the U.S. government has acted positively? Or is there an inherent government approach to issues about war and policies? Given the nature of the government, given the nature of a government, is that inherent in the way they do business, or can it ever change? Thank you.
I think that violence is inherent in the behavior of governments. I also think that deception is inherent in the behavior of governments. And the reason is simply that the interests of government are different than the interests of most of the people that government is supposed to represent. And when a government faces a population which has different interests than it, in order to maintain its power, it must lie to these people. But when governments are rich and powerful, like the United States, and this is what we've seen in history, there seems to be an inherent drive to expand at whatever cost. Sometimes that expansion might bring auxiliary benefits to somebody, but the intention is not that. The intention of government is not to solve problems of human rights. And I would argue that this is shown in history, not only of the United States government, but of other governments which have expanded their power in the world.
So it's going to be a constant battle. It's going to be a constant battle.
A constant battle. Yes, definitely. A constant battle. Yeah.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. History has shown us that, sometimes even with sustained economic and military aid, the governments that we prop up in strategically important countries, people get sick of them after a while. They don't always last. And I was just wondering what you thought are the chances of, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, that these will hold on, these noble experiments that we've got going on, or are we just tossing away a bunch more of our lives, of their lives, and money down the drain just to have two more countries on the list that aren't too fond of us?
Yes. I think that's what we're doing. I don't think we can impose a good society by force of arms. And people, we can help people in other countries, but not with invasions and not with bombings and not with military force. We can help people. And you can get a sense of how much the government cares about humanitarian aims, whatever it says about, we're against tyranny, we're against, Saddam Hussein. You get but a sense of how seriously it acts for humanitarian aims, when you see how much money it is spending on this war in Iraq and how little money it is spending to deal with the billion people in the world who don't have clean water, and how it refuses to accept the fact that a small portion of our military budget could save perhaps 1 million lives in Africa. And that suggests that we have that there's something in our policy which is, yes, to use that word, inherently not concerned with human rights.
It's about 20 minutes of 10, so I think we'll take the questions of these people who are online, and then we'll be at about 10 o'clock.
I've been reading a book called The Socrates Cafe by Christopher Phillips, and he suggests that before our national leaders begin questioning foreign policy, we as people need to start questioning basic concepts ourselves, like, what is liberty, what is democracy, what is, terrorism would be a good example. What is that exactly? And start batting these ideas around, and then maybe it'll make a difference. It's not the national leaders that need to debate, it's we who need to debate. And as history teachers and as historians, we're in a good position to be able to do this because we have the history to back us up. Now all we need to do is kind of make that multidimensional by putting some philosophy in it as well and making it, more exciting. That might be a good way to excite students. I just wanted to know if you have any comment on the role of philosophy in history.
Well, philosophy is not to be left to the philosophers, right? Just as history is not to be left just to the historians. And the philosophical questions inevitably come into play when you're dealing with war and peace and the distribution of resources. So, sure, philosophy can be made relevant to our immediate problems, just as history can. Yeah.
Thank you. I see we do have someone up. Let's just keep our comments and questions brief so everyone has a chance to speak here before we have to leave.
Do you believe that the United States has the right to go into another country and, for women's civil rights in the Middle East, do you think that our country has the right to tell some countries in the Middle East how to treat their women? So if we could go in there and fight for the rights of women, not have them beaten to death.
I'm sorry. Has the right to do what? Does our country have the right to do what?
Well, some women in the Middle East are treated unfairly, to our standards. Do you think the United States has the right to go over there into another country and tell them how to treat their women?
To tell them how to
treat their women.
Treat their women. Oh. Well, I think that we have the right, sure, to tell everybody to treat their women with equality, their women. I like that. To treat the women that you own well. I think we have a right to spread good ideas everywhere. It's a question of whether we want to accompany that with the Marines, you see. But not only the United States, but people everywhere should consider themselves as having the right to spread good ideas across national borders wherever we can.
I'm a history major at Bridgewater State College, and it's an honor to hear you speak tonight. I've read many of your books, and they're quite enlightening. And in regards to cross-examining American ideology, do you think that many of the ideas that you brought up in that book are because history is not efficiently taught and thoroughly taught? Do you think that these contradictions to American ideology are, continual through history because history isn't taught correctly?
Yes. Yes, I do believe that. I'm glad you brought up my other book. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Osborne. I teach American history at Santa Ana Community College in California. And standing in in this room, in this city, at this time, is a stark reminder to me of how patriots during an earlier period in our history opposed armies of occupation. My question is, why do you think we went to war in Iraq?
Yeah. I don't like to use this word, oil, you say, but I think oil has a lot to do with it. Look, American foreign policy, ever since the end of World War II, American foreign policy in the Middle East has been centered on the question of oil. Certainly has been centered on the question of, how do we breed democracy? I mean, we have supported the kingdom, the woman-hating kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right, for all these years, ever since Roosevelt met Ibn Saud, in 1945 and made this deal where, we'll keep you in power and in turn we want access to Middle East oil. Oil has been at the center of our policy. That's why we overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. So why did we go? Yes, oil and the extension of military power and more military base. And also there are political reasons. Bush has very little to go by in winning popular support except to present himself as a strong, and he has said it, I'm your war president. Since he's no other kind of president, you see, he has to present himself as a war president because he remembers that other war presidents became more popular. So I think political, there's historical precedent for this, where political, we don't like to think this, political motivations made presidents decide the lives of thousands of people. This is true of Lyndon Johnson in making decisions about, he thought about his own political future. J.F. Kennedy, facing the election of '64, thought about what effect withdrawing troops from Vietnam would have on his re-election in '64. Bush, and going into the elder Bush, the smarter Bush, going into the first Gulf War, was faced with declining popularity and saw that going into war would... So, yeah, I would say oil, military bases, political benefit, yes.
Matthew Tobin, Boston University student. Just wanted to, I get involved in, this is more of a philosophical level question, I suppose, than a specifics, but I get involved in debates a lot at school with less intelligent people a lot of times, on certain subjects, which because I know my history a little better than they do, as much as I do, which isn't a lot. But one of the problems I always have with them is we'll argue, and I'll say something critical about the government, about whether it's current or past, and they'll come back with, they've got two mainstays all the time, and one is, well, I can't remember one of them is, but the other one, unimportant. The one they usually come back to is, but America's the greatest country in the world, and aren't you happy to live here? And I am happy, and we're obviously all happy to live here. But what would you say to that when someone says, America's the greatest country in the world? If I knew your response, I might have something better to say to them.
Actually, that question that's been said to me many times. That question has been put to me many times. America. Look, let's get real. Let's not get overblown notions of who we are. Yeah, there are great things about America, and there are terrible things about America. We're a mixed bag. We have lots of goodies in America, and lots of, we're a very rich country, but there are other countries that are very nice too. And there are countries that have better social programs than we have, that take better care of their children, better care of their old people, and have health insurance for everybody. So, you can, depending on what measure you use, you can say, oh, yeah, America is a good place, or you can say, America is not a good place. And as for our foreign policy, well, I guess the reason for staying here is that you won't be affected by American foreign policy. You see.
So,
anyway, sure.
This is not a question, and in fact, if you want to sit, Howard, you can sit.
Oh, thank you.
Tell them who you are.
I'm Stoughton Lind, and I want to say a word of appreciation about my friend of almost 45 years. 4 things. First, Howard shows us how to make one's living as an academic while writing and speaking for the world off campus as well as on. I arrived at Spelman College fresh from graduate school. I asked Howard what papers he was preparing for which professional conferences. He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He was one of 2 adult advisors to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, along with Ella Baker. He was writing a pamphlet on Albany, Georgia, where late in 1961, students at Albany State College, along with field secretaries from SNCC, were beginning to build a powerful movement from below. He was then, and remains now, primarily a people's historian. Second, maybe another way of saying the same thing, Howard has developed the art of accompanying the movement as a historian. I remember one day walking into the Zinn apartment unannounced. Howard was tape recording the narratives of 2 SNCC field secretaries who had just been released from jail. I have since done a great deal of oral history. I first got the idea of doing it not from the WPA Writers Project or from Studs Terkel, but from Howard on that day I walked in on his recording session. Third, Howard has kept his eye on the prize of structural analysis of the society as a whole. There has been too little of this in our histories. In a period when postmodernism valued small narratives, and when we were encouraged to avoid the enormous condescension of posterity by immersing ourselves in the subjective experience of the oppressed. Whatever the explanation, we have succeeded only in pressing the authors of the master narrative to alter their stories slightly, or to add a box for the poor on the side of the page. I suggest that the People's History of the United States has sold 1 million copies because left historians, that is to say the rest of us, have abandoned our obligation to explain the past conduct of society as a whole and to predict its future behavior. In other words, yes, we may talk to our heart's content about, quoting David Bryan Davis, romanticize pirates as well as prostitutes, religious zealots, bandits, highwaymen, and criminals of all sorts. The establishment will give us the franchise for chimney sweeps who get cancer or women who are burned to death when the employer locks the doors. But we must stay away from overall interpretation. To seek to thrust the people we write about into the foreground is, in Professor Davis' marvelously contemptuous turn of phrase, to become tiresome. We who accompany the poor in their tribulations, like those we study, must remember our proper place. In contrast, Howard has reminded us that we need not just truth in the form of accurate footnotes, or even truth in the form of evocative oral histories, but also truth in the form of structural understanding. We confront a big system whose advocates think in the large and have a long-term trajectory. We too need a big picture analysis. The hunger for such an analysis among students and working class intellectuals explains the sales of Howard's book. Finally, I want to applaud Howard's fidelity to what we all envisioned in the first half of the 1960s, a society in which class trumps race and gender, and our common humanity trumps all. My wife Alice and I have been doing prison work. We have given the people's history to 4 prisoners, 2 black and 2 white. One of the latter, a young white man from the South, describes how his attitudes changed while imprisoned at the Ohio State Penitentiary, a supermax prison in which prisoners are confined alone at least 23 hours a day. I have to say, he begins, that I came to OSP a stone-cold racist. He continues, 3 years at OSP has changed that 100%. It's the white police, administrators, and nurses who treat me like a, quote, nigger, unquote. Treat all of us like that. It is so frustrating to live under such an intense, voiceless oppression, to be picked on just because I'm an inmate, to be pushed and harassed physically while I'm in full restraints, and to be antagonized nonstop. Then we come to the ideological consequences of the oppression shared by white and black prisoners. I used to be proud of white historical domination, the way whites just crushed and conquered all who stood in their path historically. But now when I watch documentaries on PBS like Conquistadors or The West, it makes me mad. Because in those conquests and legal genocides, I now see the arrogance of Lieutenant X or the administrators at OSP with the blind assumption of superiority by all the frontiersmen / conquistadors / correctional officers. It's the same mentality, really. Nothing on this planet has equaled the juggernaut force of white violence, ingenuity, conquest, and superiority through numbers moving in coordination. But in that there was an ignorance that led to the death of millions and the extinction of entire cultures and animal species. And this continues still today. And he concludes, I guess living under this OSP stuff has sapped my view of white nobility and made me realize just how impossible it is to fight the entrenched administration on all levels of life of an established majority. It makes me respect the Indians who fought to the death, or the Inca and Aztec natives who stood up to the conquistadors and were mauled as a society, or the slaves who found the courage to revolt, knowing that there was no real win to be had except self-satisfaction. As I read that last sentence, I could almost hear the writer closing his copy of The People's History with a thump. So, Howard, I don't know if we in this sacred space, the Old South, have what it takes to make you president of the American Historical Association. And if we do, I should not be your campaign manager. I dare say that we might be able to elect you president of the Organization of American Historians, but I don't know if you would want that. What I am confident I can suggest, and the sons and daughters of liberty gathered here will support, and we can compel you to accept, is thank you. Thank you, as they say behind bars, for maintaining. Thank you for staying strong. Thank you for being in the struggle. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Scott.